On a quiet morning in the Oklahoma plains, Caleb Harper, a solitary rancher haunted by the mistakes of his past, discovers a young woman, battered and unconscious, on his property. Amara Kane is running from a nightmare, a human trafficking ring that almost destroyed her. As Caleb reluctantly takes her in, he's met with whispers and suspicion from the small-town community. But Amara's courage awakens something in him he thought was long gone, a chance at redemption. Together, they uncover dark secrets that lead back to a shocking revelation, tying their lives together in ways neither could have imagined. In a world where prejudice and silence reign, will an unlikely bond between two broken souls be enough to confront the shadows threatening to consume them? Shadows on the Heartland is a gripping tale of hope, forgiveness, and the transformative power of compassion. Perfect for fans of emotional drama and unflinching stories of resilience. The sun peeked over the Oklahoma plains, painting the fields with golden light. Caleb Harper sat on his creaky porch, his weathered hands cradling a chipped coffee mug. He watched the cattle in the distance and listened to the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. This was his sanctuary, a world untouched by the chaos of others. But this morning, a restless energy stirred in him. He glanced toward the far edge of his property, where the land grew wild near the old tractor shed. He hadn't walked out that far in weeks. Something about the untouched corner of his ranch tugged at him. "Guess I'd better check things out," he muttered, grabbing his hat and cane. His knee wasn't what it used to be, but the walk would do him good. The path to the shed was uneven, the grass tall and unkempt. Caleb leaned on his cane as he approached, noting the peeling paint on the old structure. He pushed the door open, and the rusty hinges groaned in protest. Inside, shadows stretched across the floor. Among the dust and forgotten tools, something caught his eye. A figure, small, frail, lay curled on a hay bale. Caleb's breath hitched. "What in the world?" he whispered, stepping closer. The figure was a young woman, her dark skin smudged with dirt, her clothes tattered. Her chest rose and fell faintly, but she didn't stir. Caleb knelt, his knees protesting, and pressed trembling fingers to her neck. Relief washed over him when he found a pulse. "Miss?" he called softly, his voice echoing in the shed. She didn't respond. His mind raced. Who was she? How had she ended up here? He considered leaving her for a moment, but the thought unsettled him. Caleb straightened with difficulty, then scooped her into his arms. She was worryingly light, like she hadn't eaten in days. His muscles strained, but he tightened his grip. "You're not staying here," he murmured, heading back toward the farmhouse. Caleb's truck rumbled down the dusty road toward Prairie Bend. The woman lay slumped in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. Caleb glanced at her, worry creasing his brow. "Hang in there," he said, more to himself than her. As he turned onto the main road, he spotted Clyde Dawson leaning against his truck, arms crossed. Caleb slowed to a stop, rolling down the window. "Morning, Clyde," Caleb said curtly. Clyde tipped his hat, his gaze sliding to the unconscious woman. "What's all this about?" "Found her on my property," Caleb replied. "She needs help." Clyde raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's your problem?" Caleb tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Seems like it is now." "Suit yourself," Clyde said with a shrug, stepping back. "Good luck with that." Caleb drove off, muttering under his breath. The clinic wasn't far, but the road felt endless. The clinic's receptionist looked up as Caleb carried the woman through the door. Her polite smile faltered. "She's in bad shape," Caleb said, his voice gruff. "Needs help." The receptionist hesitated. "Do you know her name?" What happened? No idea, Caleb said, his patience thinning. I just found her. A nurse emerged, her professional demeanor betraying a flicker of surprise. Bring her this way, she said, motioning to a room. Caleb laid the woman on the examination table, stepping back as the nurse checked her vitals. He caught snippets of their hushed conversation. Where'd he find her? No ID. Looks like she's been through hell. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew what they were thinking, but he wouldn't dignify it with a response. Caleb slumped into a chair in the waiting room, exhaustion settling in. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. He stared at his hands, still grimy from the walk. The nurse returned, clipboard in hand. She's stable for now, severely dehydrated and malnourished. We're running tests. Caleb nodded. She'll be okay. We'll do everything we can. As the nurse walked away, Caleb overheard whispers from the front desk. A man like him bringing in a woman like her. It's strange, isn't it? Probably trouble. Caleb's fists clenched. He stood abruptly, his boots scuffing the tile. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, but the judgment in their voices stung. He stepped outside, the morning sun blinding him. As he gazed at the horizon, he couldn't shake the image of the woman's frail body. Something about her stirred an ache he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The clinic room was quiet, save for the faint beep of a heart monitor. Amara's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. The sterile smell made her nose wrinkle. Where? Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. A nurse entered, noticing her stirring. Good morning, she said softly, adjusting the four in Amara's arm. You're at the clinic in Prairie Bend. You've been through a lot, but you're safe now. Amara blinked, trying to sit up, but her strength failed her. The nurse steadied her gently. There's someone here who found you. He's been waiting to hear how you're doing. A few minutes later, Caleb walked in, his boots echoing softly on the tiled floor. He hesitated at the doorway before stepping closer. You're awake? He said, his voice a mix of relief and awkwardness. That's good. Amara studied him, her brow furrowed. Who are you? She croaked. Name's Caleb. Found you on my land. Figured I couldn't just leave you there. Her lips pressed into a thin line, confusion and suspicion warring in her tired eyes. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, gripping his hat in both hands. You don't have to say anything. Just rest up. Later that day, Amara sat propped up in bed, sipping water. Caleb returned, this time pulling a chair to her bedside. I suppose you're wondering how you ended up in that shed, Caleb said, breaking the silence. Amara nodded weakly. I was running. From what? Caleb's tone was gentle but firm, his blue eyes steady. Her hands tightened around the cup. Bad people, she whispered. They took me. I escaped, but I don't know how far I got before I collapsed. Caleb's jaw tightened. You mean traffickers? She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes welling up. Caleb leaned back, exhaling sharply. Hell of a thing to go through. Amara's voice was barely audible. I didn't think anyone would help me. Well, Caleb said gruffly, maybe it's time you caught a break. Word traveled fast in Prairie Bend. By the time Caleb stopped at the diner for lunch, the room went quiet as he walked in. A group of locals exchanged glances, whispering behind their coffee mugs. Margaret, the diner owner, greeted him warmly. Afternoon, Caleb. Your usual? Yeah, Caleb replied, sliding into a booth. He felt the weight of the stairs behind him. The conversation at a nearby table wasn't subtle. What's he doing? Bringing someone like that here, one man muttered. Margaret placed Caleb's plate in front of him, her hazel eyes narrowing as she glanced at the gossipers. Don't pay them any mind, she said quietly. Caleb nodded, but the tension lingered. As he finished his meal, Margaret leaned in. If you ever need help, you let me know, all right? Appreciate it, Margaret, Caleb said, tipping his hat as he left. The next day, Caleb brought Amara to the diner, despite her hesitation. I don't know if I should, she began, but Caleb cut her off. You need food, and Margaret's the best cook in town. Don't worry about the rest. Margaret's face lit up when they entered. Well, look who's here. Have a seat. Amara kept her head down as they slid into a booth. Margaret placed plates of steaming food in front of them and leaned close to Amara. You're welcome here, sweetheart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Amara managed a small smile. Thank you. As they ate, Caleb noticed Amara's tension ease slightly. For the first time, she spoke more freely, asking questions about the town and the ranch. As the sun set, Caleb pulled the truck into his driveway. Amara gazed out the window at the sprawling fields, her expression unreadable. You can stay here for now, Caleb said. Ain't much, but it's quiet. Amara hesitated. Why are you helping me? Caleb sighed, staring at the horizon. Guess I just figure everyone deserves a chance. Amara didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smile crossed her face. Together, they walked toward the farmhouse, the evening air thick with the scent of hay and the promise of something new. The soft crunch of gravel underfoot broke the stillness as Caleb showed Amara to the spare room. The house had a rustic charm. Weathered wood floors, simple furniture, and windows that framed endless fields of wheat. It ain't much, Caleb said, setting a folded blanket on the bed, but it's warm and it's quiet. You'll be safe here. Amara lingered in the doorway, unsure. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Caleb leaned on his cane, his gaze steady. I don't need to know you to see you've been through hell. Everyone deserves a place to catch their breath. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. As Caleb walked out, he paused. Dinner's at 6. You're welcome to join if you're feeling up to it. That evening, Amara shuffled into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of something savory. Caleb was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. Didn't think you'd come down, he said, glancing over his shoulder. I didn't want to be rude, Amara replied, sitting cautiously at the table. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and set one in front of her. Hope you like it. It's no fancy diner meal, but it'll stick to your ribs. Amara hesitated before taking a bite. It's good, she said, surprised. They ate in silence for a while until Caleb spoke. You said you were running from bad people. Traffickers? Amara tensed, her spoon hovering over the bowl. Yes. Caleb leaned back in his chair. I don't need all the details, but if there's something you think I should know, you can tell me. She met his eyes, searching for judgment and finding none. They said no one would believe me. That even if I got away, I'd have nowhere to go. Well, you proved him wrong, didn't you? Caleb said gruffly. You got away, and you found somewhere. Amara's lip trembled, but she quickly composed herself. Thank you for this. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I'll put you to work soon enough. For the first time, Amara smiled back. The next day, Caleb was mending a fence when Clyde Dawson's truck rolled into the driveway. The burly man climbed out, his boots kicking up dust. Morning, Caleb, Clyde drawled, eyeing the house. Heard you've got company. Caleb wiped his brow with his sleeve. What's it to you? Just curious. Folks in town are talking. A young woman showing up out of nowhere. People want to know if it's trouble. She's not trouble, Caleb said firmly. She's just someone who needed help. Clyde crossed his arms. You sure about that? These days, you never know who you're letting in. Caleb took a step closer, his voice low and steady. She's staying here, Clyde. That's all you need to know. Clyde shrugged, his expression unreadable. Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you if things go south. As Clyde drove off, Amara appeared on the porch, her face pale. Who was that? Neighbor, Caleb said. He's all bark. Don't let him get to you. Amara nodded, but the encounter left her uneasy. That night, Caleb was jolted awake by a scream. He grabbed his cane and hurried to the spare room, finding Amara sitting up in bed, her face glistening with sweat. Amara, he said gently. Her wide eyes darted to him, and she hugged her knees to her chest. I thought I was back there, she whispered. I couldn't breathe. Caleb pulled a chair to her bedside, his voice calm. It was just a dream. You're safe here. Amara nodded, but tears slipped down her cheeks. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe. You will, Caleb said. It takes time, but you will. They sat in silence until her breathing steadied. As Caleb stood to leave, she spoke softly. Do you ever have nightmares? He paused at the door. I do, but I've learned you can't let them run your life. Her eyes followed him as he left, her heart heavy yet slightly lighter. The next morning, Caleb found Amara sitting on the porch, staring out at the fields. Couldn't sleep? He asked, handing her a cup of coffee. Not much, she admitted, cradling the mug in her hands. I've been thinking, I can't just hide forever. No one's a skin, you two, Caleb said. But you've got to heal first. Amara shook her head. What if they find me? I need to do something. Caleb frowned. Like what? I don't know, she said, her voice shaking. But I can't let them keep doing this to people. There are others. Still trapped? Caleb studied her, a mix of admiration and worry crossing his face. You're braver than most folks I know. But if you're serious about this, we need a plan. Amara looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. You'd help me? He nodded slowly. We'll figure it out. Together. Caleb and Amara sat at the kitchen table, a map of the state spread out before them. The soft glow of the hanging light emphasized the intensity in their expressions. So, you're sure it's this place? Caleb asked, tapping a marked location. Amara nodded. It's a shelter in name only. That's where they kept me before I got away. Caleb rubbed his chin. We're gonna need more than just a location. Margaret might know where to start. Later that afternoon, Caleb and Amara stopped by Margaret's diner. She leaned against the counter as Caleb explained the situation in hushed tones. Human trafficking? Margaret's voice was sharp but quiet. She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. That's heavy stuff, Caleb. I know, but we need information, Caleb said. Anything you've heard? Margaret's lips tightened. There have been rumors about shelters being a front for something shady, but nothing concrete. If you're serious about this, you'll need proof. That evening, Caleb returned home to find graffiti sprayed on his barn. Leave town? Amara froze, her breath catching. They know I'm here. Caleb shook his head. No, this is about me. People don't like when you go against the grain around here. What if it's them? She whispered. What if they're already watching? Caleb placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. If they were, they wouldn't waste time on paint. We're fine. But this means we're on the right track. The next day in town, the chill was palpable. Neighbors avoided Caleb's gaze, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Even Clyde passed by with nothing more than a grunt. As Caleb loaded supplies into his truck, Margaret approached. "You two all right?" "Yeah," Caleb replied. "Just more reason to keep going, da." Margaret handed him a slip of paper. "This is the number of a reporter I trust. He's been looking into trafficking rings. If anyone can help, it's him." Back at the ranch, Caleb found Amara in the living room, staring at a crumpled piece of paper. "What's that?" he asked. She hesitated before handing it to him. "It's the address of another place they took me. I remembered it this morning." Caleb studied the paper. "You sure about this?" "I think so," Amara said. "It's where they moved girls when they stopped trusting them. I only spent a day there, but—" Caleb nodded. "It's a start. This reporter might know how to connect the dots." That evening, Caleb made the call. The reporter, a man named Jonathan, was eager to help. "I've been tracking this for months," he said. "If she can confirm anything about their operations, we might have enough to act." The next day, Caleb stopped by Clyde's farm. Clyde was repairing a fence, his brow furrowing as Caleb approached. "What do you want now?" Clyde asked, not looking up. "I need help," Caleb said simply. Clyde straightened, crossing his arms. "With what?" Caleb hesitated, then said, "Exposing a trafficking ring." Clyde's eyes narrowed. "That girl got you into this?" "No," Caleb said firmly. "I got myself into it when I decided to help her. Now, are you in or not?" Clyde stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "What do you need?" Caleb explained the plan to gather evidence with Jonathan's help. Clyde grunted. "You're crazy. But if this is real, I'll back you up." That night, Caleb and Amara sat by the fire. The warmth did little to ease the tension in the room. "Jonathan says we've got enough to go to the authorities," Caleb said. "But we'll need to act fast before they move anyone." Amara's hands clenched in her lap. "What if they're still holding someone there?" Caleb sighed. "That's what we're trying to stop." "I want to go with you," Amara said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Caleb said. "It's too dangerous." "They won't recognize me," Amara argued. "I can point out things you'd miss." Caleb studied her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "All right, but you do exactly what I say. No risks." Amara nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Let's do this." The early morning air was thick with tension as Caleb and Amara drove down the highway. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale glow over the empty road. Amara sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You okay?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. "I'm scared," Amara admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I have to do this." "You're not alone in this," Caleb said firmly. "We'll handle it together." Amara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As they approached the city, the sprawling farmland gave way to urban sprawl, and the weight of what they were about to do settled over them both. The address Amara had provided led them to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Caleb parked the truck a safe distance away, and they sat in silence, studying the building. "That's it," Amara whispered. "I remember the red door." Caleb nodded and reached for his phone, dialing Jonathan, the reporter who had agreed to meet them nearby. Within minutes, Jonathan arrived, his notepad in hand. "This is the place?" Jonathan asked, his tone serious. "Yeah," Caleb said. "What's the plan?" "I've got contacts with law enforcement, but they've been slow to act without solid evidence," Jonathan explained. "If we can get photos or confirmation of activity inside, it'll force their hand." Amara hesitated. I can go inside. I know the layout. Absolutely not, Caleb said, his tone sharp. It's too dangerous. She's right, Jonathan interjected. If she knows the place, she might be able to guide us from outside. Reluctantly, Caleb agreed. They decided to move in closer, using the shadows for cover. Amara directed them to a side window, and Jonathan used his camera to document what they could see inside. From their vantage point, they saw several young women being led through the warehouse by armed guards. Amara's breath hitched. They're still holding people, she whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. We can't wait for the cops. We need to do something now. Are you sure? Jonathan asked, his voice wavering. This could get ugly fast. I've been through ugly before, Caleb said, his tone resolute. Together, they devised a plan. Caleb would create a distraction, drawing the guards away, while Jonathan called the authorities. Amara would guide the victims out through a back exit. As Caleb slipped into the warehouse, Amara whispered, "Be careful." He turned back briefly. "You too." Inside, Caleb knocked over a stack of crates, sending them crashing to the floor. The noise drew the guards' attention, and they rushed toward the sound. Caleb ducked behind a pile of machinery, his heart pounding. Meanwhile, Amara led the women through the shadows to the exit. "This way," she urged, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The plan was working, until one of the guards spotted them. "Hey!" he shouted, raising his weapon. Caleb emerged from the shadows, wielding a rusted pipe. "Over here!" he yelled, drawing the guard's attention away from the women. The guard turned toward Caleb, giving Amara and the others the precious seconds they needed to escape. Once outside, Amara helped the women into Jonathan's car, urging him to take them to safety. She turned back to find Caleb limping toward her, his face pale but determined. "You okay?" she asked, rushing to his side. "Been better," he muttered, leaning on her for support. As they moved away from the warehouse, Caleb noticed a stack of papers on a nearby desk. Something compelled him to grab them. Later, as they sifted through the documents in Jonathan's car, Amara froze. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "This name," Amara said, pointing to a file. "My mother. She's listed here." Caleb's heart sank as he recognized the name. I knew her," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. Amara's eyes widened. "What do you mean you knew her?" "She came to my ranch years ago," Caleb said, his voice breaking. I turned her away. I didn't know what she was running from." Tears streamed down Amara's face. "She trusted you, and you sent her back to them?" "I didn't know," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "If I'd known, I would have done something." Amara stared at him, her expression a mixture of betrayal and anguish. "She died because of them. Because you didn't help." The ride back to the ranch was silent. Amara stared out the window, her mind racing with emotions. Caleb gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Once home, Caleb sat on the porch, the weight of his past crushing him. Amara joined him, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "I don't expect you to," Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Amara nodded, her heart still heavy but her resolve stronger than ever. "Then let's make sure no one else has to go through this." Together, they began to plan their next steps, knowing their fight was far from over. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the farmhouse, casting a warm glow across the living room. Caleb sat in his usual chair, staring into his coffee cup. Amara joined him, her expression hesitant but determined. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Caleb looked up, his blue eyes heavy with guilt. "I know." Amara sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "What happened with my mother? I can't pretend it didn't hurt. But I also know you've been carrying that guilt for years." "I failed her," Caleb admitted. "And now, every time I see you, it's like a reminder of what I didn't do." "You didn't know," Amara said softly, "and now you're trying to make it right. That counts for something." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken pain between them beginning to ease. "So, what do we do now?" Amara asked. Caleb straightened. "We keep going. There's more people out there who need help. And maybe we can do something about it." Word of the trafficking ring's exposure spread quickly through Prairie Bend. At first, the town was skeptical, but as rescued victims shared their stories in the news, attitudes began to shift. Margaret approached Caleb and Amara at the diner one afternoon, her smile warm. "You've done something incredible," she said. "People are starting to see things differently." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Not everyone." "True," Margaret admitted, "but change takes time. And you've started something important." As they left the diner, Clyde approached, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I heard about what you did," he said awkwardly. "Guess I was wrong about you." Amara crossed her arms. "Took you long enough." Clyde chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, I'm not good at admitting when I'm wrong. But for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." Amara smiled faintly. "Thanks, Clyde." Back at the ranch, Amara paced the living room, a notebook in hand. "So, I've been thinking," she began. "What if we use the farm for something bigger? Like a place where survivors can come to heal?" Caleb frowned thoughtfully. "You mean like a shelter?" "More than that," Amara said, her voice gaining confidence. "A place where they can work, learn, and rebuild their lives. Somewhere safe." Caleb leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That's a big undertaking." "I know," Amara said, "but we've already done so much. Why stop now?" Caleb nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." Over the next few weeks, Caleb and Amara worked tirelessly to transform the ranch. They cleaned out old buildings, repaired fences, and reached out to the community for support. Margaret organized a fundraiser at the diner, and even Clyde offered to help. On the day of their first event, the farm buzzed with activity. Families strolled through the fields, sampling fresh produce and listening to local musicians. Amara stood at the entrance, greeting visitors with a warm smile. "This is incredible," Margaret said, joining her. "You've turned this place into something amazing." Amara looked around, her heart swelling with pride. "I couldn't have done it without Caleb," Margaret nodded. "And he couldn't have done it without you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb and Amara sat on the porch, watching the last of the guests leave. The fields glowed in the golden light, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets. "You did good today," Caleb said, his voice gruff but kind. "We did good," Amara corrected, her smile warm. Caleb raised his glass of iced tea. "To new beginnings." Amara clinked her glass against his. "To new beginnings." They sat in silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. The farm, once a place of solitude and regret, had become a beacon of hope for them, for the community, and for everyone who would come through its gates. And though their journey was far from over, they knew one thing for certain. Together, they could face anything.